I don't think there's any more important text in all of the New Testament that defines the work of Jesus than this one. That Jesus was sent to fulfill all righteousness.
Greetings and welcome to All Righteousness. It's been a while since I last posted an episode. But regardless, welcome back. And today I want to talk about discipling your children. Now, a little disclaimer, I don't have children, but I am a youth pastor. And I have a small youth group. I visit campuses often, so on and so forth. And what I see is a little surprising, even among Christian parents and families and children, and that's because I don't want to say any of this as a broad stroke. Specifically. So I'm not calling out any one person. I'm not going to call out any one person, but for broad strokes purposes. When I interact with students, especially within youth group, they have no Christian worldview. And not that they need to articulate one deeply and intellectually and all that. Because we see, I don't know if I've done a video or not on the live stream, but something we've always had as worldview, and we're just now studying it as the human race. And I compare that to a child always eats, but he doesn't study nutrition until he's in college. But the young Christians I interact with today, the high school students, and even the adults that are my age, they don't live in a Christian worldview. It's not that they can't articulate it. It's not that they can't talk about it, because that's sort of irrelevant. It's that they don't live it, right? So it's not in their lifestyle. It's not something they believe. So within worldview, we have what's called catechesis, which is what you believe. And again, I'm not saying they can't articulate their beliefs, because even if they can't, their beliefs should still come out. I'm saying their beliefs aren't within the Christian worldview. I'm not saying they're unsaved. I'm not saying they're heretics. I'm just saying they don't really line up with the Christian worldview. And so there's two reasons for that. Because there's not always one reason behind that. It's not just because they're brats. It's not just because of their parents. It's not just because of this or that. The first and main reason is because they lack the axle to that wheel. They lack the very thing that wheel, the worldview wheel, spins on, and that is grace. That's Christ. That's relationship with Him. And I'm not talking about lovey-dovey feeling relationship. It's not you're not dating Jesus. I'm saying relationship in the true meaning of the word, in that it's an interaction between you and God. It's not always loving. It's not always easy. It's just an interaction. It's something you come to often. So that is always the main problem, always. And it will always be the main problem, that lack of an axle, the lack of Christ in your life. But I think that problem would be fixed very easily if we discipled our children. Now, the big call on this is on the parents, right? Parents need to be discipling their children. Now, there is kind of a secondary, less impactful call, and that's on the church. The church needs to start discipling children too. And look, as a youth pastor, I'll admit it's not always easy. One, because sometimes they don't want to meet with you. Two, because unless youth pastoring is your full-time job, there's a lot of other things you have to do throughout the day and throughout the week. And so I fall short in this area too, of not always being as excited to disciple, not always discipling when I can, yada, yada, yada. But the real push for discipling needs to come from the church, and it needs to be pushed into the home. We need to be pushing our parents to disciple more. I've had this conversation with my parents. We didn't really get discipled in the home, at least not the way I imagine it. We were raised in a Christian home. We were raised with good morals, good values. We knew who God was. We knew the gospel. We knew John 3:16. We knew God created the world, right? Stuff like that. And I talked to my parents. I said, we knew those things. That's great. We were raised good. But we were never discipled. We were never walked through the spiritual highs and the spiritual lows. We were never developed spiritually by you guys. And again, I talked with them about this, so it wasn't a slap in the face of them. But I said any real big spiritual development in my life kind of came by a combination of you guys and a whole bunch of others, and obviously solely God's grace. And like, yeah, you're right. We didn't really disciple you that much, but they're great parent. They are great parents. They gave us the gospel, and they raised us well. But children who are in homes as good as mine without discipleship don't always turn out as good of kids as me and my two sisters. I'm not saying they're bad, terrible kids. I'm not saying they're great kids either, though. Most kids that grew up in a home like me, where it's a Christian home, they knew the gospel, but they never were discipled. They lack a Christian worldview, and some don't even believe anymore. And why don't they believe? Well, it's a lot of things. Okay, for one, that's all in God's hands. But for two, on the human level, it's because of a lack of teaching for the most part. Like I always tell Christina, if our kids, I pray for my children's salvation often. I don't have children. I don't plan on having children for another 7 to 10 years. But I pray for their salvation often. And I tell Christina, if our kids, if the Lord sovereignly decides that they are not going to be saved, or if they decide they're not going to be saved, I tell Christina all the time that our children will be the most learned atheists in the Christian religion ever. Meaning, if our children are atheist or agnostic or Catholic or Mormon or whatever, if they're not Christian, they're going to be the most educated about the Christian religion wherever they go, because we're going to raise them to the best of our ability on Christian values, and we're going to disciple them. And I know I hear everyone who don't have kids yet, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know what? I'm going to be the parent of my child, and I know what I'm going to do with my child. I'm not going to do it perfectly. I'm going to fail, but I know what I'm going to do. And I can assure you, my children, and I pray that they're saved, but they will know, right? The Bible talks about people are judged on the truth that they were given and whether or not they accepted that truth. We do this within presuppositional apologetics. We understand as Christians that it's up to God to change the heart. God is the one who will bring salvation or withhold salvation, which we don't like that idea, but it's true. And so within presuppositional apologetics, our motivation isn't to change the mind necessarily. Our motivation is to bring truth to the unbeliever's mind. So when I engage with the unbeliever, I don't sit there and try to change their mind, get them to change their mind. I bring them truth. Here is the truth of the gospel. Here is the gospel. Here is the word. And they're judged according to that, according to the measure of truth that they've been given. So, I don't know where I was going with that, but my children, as well as everyone, they should be presented with truth. So when they walk away, they will know, if they ever do walk away, they will know truth to the best of their ability, because to the best of our ability, we're going to raise them that way. But going back to the main point, and that is discipling children. It's so crucial. 80% of children who grow up in the public school system, 80% of Christian children, who grow up in the public school system, once they get into college, they walk away from their faith. 80% of our children, of our young adults, walk away from the faith once they get into college. So you ask, why? Why? Okay, the large, grand, universal picture is this. It's in God's hands, and God knows what he's doing, okay? But when we talk about God's sovereignty, it doesn't mean that we just sit here and wait for him to do something. We do it, and what we do is within his sovereignty. So we have to ask still, why? Why are they walking away from the faith? And if you look at historical, classic Christianity, there was much discipleship coming in the home. We live in a culture that on average, Christian culture, that on average spends 2 hours a week. Parents spend only 2 hours a week with their children on spiritual matters. 2 hours a week, okay? We send our kids to public school for 35 hours a week. And only 2 hours are spent talking about spiritual matters. And we wonder why they walk away when they get into college, when they're in school for almost all day, every day. It's like it's like we sit our kid in front of a TV for 35 hours a week, teach him how to play baseball for 2 hours a week, and once game time comes, we wonder why he sucks. Well, it's because we didn't spend time developing his athletic abilities, right? We didn't spend time with that. We didn't grow that. And so the reason they're leaving the faith is because we don't disciple our children anymore. Now that's not for everyone. There are some homes who disciple their children very well, and they still walk away. And really, that's all in God's hands. But a majority of us don't disciple our children. And you look at the homes. Now, I'm not advocating for homeschool. I'm not advocating against homeschool. My mind is kind of locked in a box thinking about that right now. But you look at the homeschool ratings, 20% of Christians who grow up in homeschool walk away from the faith. 80% stay with the faith. So it's a flip. When they're homeschooled in the Christian community, right? I'm not talking about everyone, but Christians who are homeschooled, only 20% leave the faith compared to the public school Christians, 80% of them leaving the faith. And you look at the difference. There's way more time spent in the home with the child. That's how it's always been. The public school system, for example, and this is kind of a side note, it has not always been this way. Like some of the most intellectual people in our nation's history did not go to public school. They were schooled, they were educated, but they did not go to public education. And so, where's it going with that? Oh, that just shows you that you don't need public schooling to be smart, to be intellectual. We have the highest functioning illiteracy rate ever. Right? Everyone says, well, most everyone can read and write now. Most everyone, way more than they used to be able to. Yeah, we can read and write, but we have no idea what we're reading about, and we have no idea how to formulate a sentence. That's functional illiteracy. That's like being able to turn on the computer, but not being able to use it. And so, going back to discipling children, but you notice in the home, when they're homeschooled, they're way more time with the parents. That's 35 plus hours, probably more like 70 hours a week of discipleship. And they're staying with the faith. So discipleship is vitally important. And I want to play a video today because I want to show you something that this is just a small portion of what we as parents, I'm not including myself in there, but what you guys as parents have to deal with. And this is why discipleship is so crucial, because in this video, when they talk about the things they talk about, if we don't kind of undo that when they get home, if we don't train them and teach them responses, then they will grow up without discipleship. They will grow up without a Christian worldview. So let's go through this video.
Okay, so I heard you're a Christian.
Yes, the rumors are true.
Well, I'm glad you found something that works for you.
Well, it doesn't just work for me. Christianity is actually true. It describes reality.
Right there, I think that's a belief that a lot of us would not be able to defend, that Christianity isn't just true for me. It's true for everyone. It's true for whether you believe or not. It's true for you. And so the guy's response, who's not a Christian, I'm assuming, his response is, well, okay, yeah, that works for you, and that's great. But don't impose that belief on me. And the name of this video, if you're wondering, I should have told you, it says, Are you tolerant? Quiz. And he says, well, that you can't push beliefs on other people. Christianity is true for you, but not necessarily everyone else. And so how do we defend that, right? This is what our kids are being taught. In fact, it's probably even more strict on them now. I've heard stories of kids getting in trouble for even mentioning God's name in school. But when they do mention it and they're allowed to talk about it, the common response is, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for little Johnny over here or Susie, right? And now, look, I'm not expecting our eighth graders to stand up and articulate clearly the truths of the Christian gospel and how it affects morality and society and all that stuff. I'm not expecting that. But I am expecting parents to be able to disciple their kids in that. So when they come home and say, well, our teacher said that Christianity is not true for everyone. Parents, what is your response to that? Right? I know most parents say, well, it is, or agree and say, yeah, they're right. It's not true for everyone. But the fact is that it is. And how are we discipling and training our kids through that? Now, look, I don't expect them to come home one night and say that, and you and your child walk through that in one night, and the next day they go home and defeat their teacher in an argument. It's going to happen over a lifelong period. But our children are being introduced to these arguments day by day, and they have no response for it. And again, we're wondering why they're walking away later in their life.
Yeah, okay, it's true for you, but it's not true for everyone. And don't you think everyone has a right to believe whatever they want to believe?
Yeah, people should choose their own beliefs. I'm all for that. But that doesn't mean that everyone's beliefs are true.
Whoa, don't you think that's a little narrow-minded?
So, again, to the Christians out there, when you say, well, not everyone believes is true, first of all, I think we live in a Christian culture that would not say that. We would say, well, people want to believe what they believe. You know why we believe that is because we have grown up, most of us listening to Joel Osteen, right? But you have to accept the fact that not everyone's beliefs are true. And someone says, well, it's narrow-minded, right? How do you deal with that? How do you respond to that? And I think the guy in the video has kind of a good response to it.
Well, that's the way truth is. It's narrow and exclusive.
Maybe for you.
It is for everybody. 2 + 2 =
4.
Right. But you just excluded lots of numbers. See, that doesn't mean you're narrow-minded. It means that truth is narrow because it excludes all the answers that are not true.
Okay, that works for math, but not for personal beliefs.
So right there, we
philosophy
see an
professor
example
says there's two
where
kinds of
the truth is narrow-minded, right? And that's fine. That's what truth is. That's what did Jesus say? Is the way broad and wide and big with many different lanes? He said, no, it's extremely narrow. And it's very hard to get into, even if you have riches, right? And so we bring the example of math. It's like we're willing to accept the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, but not that one philosophical idea is true over another philosophical idea. We forget also that at its core, at its root, math is also philosophy, right? It's not... it's something that we can kind of work out and evidence really fast and really quick and really tangibly. But at its very, 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 very core, Math started out as philosophy, and at its very core is philosophy still. And so I think there's a problem there's a pro and con in oversimplifying the narrow-mindedness of truth with that math equation. The pro is this, that truth is in fact narrow when you show that, right? So when we say, someone says, well, truth isn't necessarily absolute, it's not narrow-minded. And you say, well, yeah, it is. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's one number. 2 plus 2 isn't any other number, and there's an infinite amount of numbers. But there's only one true number to the equation, 2 plus 2. No one's going to deny that. And so they have to say, well, that's absolutely true. But they would admit that they don't live in absolute truth whatsoever. And so when and so the equation brings to their attention that there is absolute truth, but it also oversimplifies it, and they say, well, it's kind of limited to math. That can't, like the guy said in the video, that can't be for philosophical ideas either.
My philosophy professor says there's two kinds of truth. There's absolute truth, like back in the Dark Ages, if something was true, it was objectively true for everybody, everywhere, all the time. But now he says we're enlightened, and we know there's no such thing as absolute truth.
By the way, don't you just love this background music, this little smooth jazz upright bass? Okay, so the professor, right? That's what you have to worry about when your kid goes to college. I'm teaching an apologetics class in April, and I haven't talked to Caitlin yet, but I really want my sister Caitlin to take this class because I know she's going to college, and I want her to be prepared. But the professor, right, the learned professor says, we used to work with absolute truth, but now that doesn't really exist anymore. We don't really have absolute truth. It's all relative. And so absolute truth doesn't exist. And you'll see when I play the rest of this video, that argument is just obliterated. But I've said in earlier videos on Facebook and whatnot, what do we do? Because we as Christians, we have the real message of truth. It's absolutely true. And we're called to spread that truth. So the question becomes, what do we do when we live in a culture that denies absolute truth? How do we give absolute truth to a culture that denies absolute truth? Well, again, you have to show them that you have to answer the cool according to his folly, right? You have to show them that the claim that there's no absolute truth cannot stand. But going back to discipling children, we're not teaching them this. We're not teaching our kids this. And listen, it can't always come from the youth pastor, right? The youth pastor isn't there to disciple your kids for you. The youth pastor is there to supplement the discipleship your kids are going through, to further develop, right? We're the assistant coach, if you want to say it that way. And where our kids are not being taught real, solid, foundational answers. They're being taught, well, just love your neighbor, that's it. You don't need to answer for that. When in fact, loving your neighbor is giving them an answer. It is giving them an answer to their questions. And so, again, we have to equip our children. And these are the arguments that they're hearing every single day. And it's very apparent. It's very apparent. So let's play the rest of this video.
Is it absolutely true that there's no absolute truth?
Absolutely. And the other kind of truth is where each individual creates his or her own reality. That's called relative truth.
And does your relative truth apply to me too?
Huh?
Is the relative truth you've created true for everyone or just you?
Oh, relative truth applies to everyone, everywhere.
So, relative truth is absolutely true?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, with so many beliefs out there, you can't just go around believing that your belief is right.
Is your belief that you shouldn't believe your belief is right?
Yeah.
Boom, roasted. Got him, right? That's the foolishness of that position. There's no absolute truth. Are you absolutely sure there's no truth? And absolutely, I'm sure there's no absolute truth. There's relative truth that only applies to different individuals relative to yada, yada, yada. Okay, so does your relative truth, the truth of relativity, does that apply to everyone? Well, absolutely applies. Relative truth applies to everyone. do you see the problem with that argumentation, right? But again, I'm kind of spending too much time talking about the arguments and not the parents, the youth pastor, the church pastor. You have to be discipling your children. It's a must because they're talking about this stuff daily. It doesn't come out explicitly. Teacher doesn't walk in the classroom and say there's no absolute truth. No, it doesn't come out that way. It comes out in the interactions, and it comes out when the topics are brought up. So watch what this guy, the unbeliever, says next.
If you go around saying that Christianity is absolutely true, it makes people who disagree with you feel bad. It's a form of oppression. It's hate speech. That's why our campus has all those safe spaces.
This argument that he just said, that it's a form of oppression and hate speech, and that it's offensive, this is not at all an exaggeration. In fact, it's maybe a conservative view of how someone would respond to the things that Christians say on college campuses. So don't sit there and listen to this and say, "Oh man, that's kind of dramatic." It's not. This is what we hear, and this is what your children will hear. Like when your child in school brings up God, and someone doesn't agree with that, not even not like it, right? They say, "Well, I don't agree with that." The school system will always cater to the child that doesn't agree with Christ than the one that does. We live in a country full of double standards, and you have to teach your children how to deal with that. So when he says that's a form of hate speech, intolerance, and a lack of compassion, they actually mean that, right? So again, teach your children how to defend their faith. So that's it for the video. It just goes on. He deals with the fact that, I mean, he says, you're telling me not to express my opinions and my beliefs and whatnot, yet you're doing the same exact thing this very second. And so it's important that we teach our children how to deal with these arguments. It's important that they know how to deal with the arguments. So disciple your children. It's I don't know. I'm overstating it at this point, but it's so important. Vodi Bakum has a quote that says, "If we send our children to Caesar, we can't be surprised when they come back home acting like Romans. It should be no surprise to us." So, apologetics doesn't have to be this super deep intellectual thing. It's simple, right? We can make it deep and intellectual, and it definitely can and does get that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be as simple as defending the fact that there is absolute truth, which for some reason has become so complex in our culture. The Christian faith doesn't have to be complex, right? It is complex. It doesn't have to be communicated that way. There are real arguments for Christianity. There is real evidence for Christianity. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's not just true for us. There's real evidence out there. So when I hear people say, well, I heard someone say the other day, I said, what would your response be to an atheist? They say, well, God's wrong, blah, 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 blah. And they say, well, we don't really have evidence for God. We just have our faith. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? We have so much evidence for God. It's unbelievable. Literally, it's unbelievable because we have so much evidence that people still don't believe in him. And again, it's because their hearts are dark and there's a spiritual aspect to that. But it makes my chest hurt when I hear Christians say, we don't have real evidence for God. We just have our faith. Now, do we have our faith? Absolutely we have our faith, right? But our faith is what enables us to give evidence for the gospel. So, parents, disciple your children. Go to your youth pastor, go to your church leader, go to other parents that are doing it well, and learn how to disciple your children. It's never too late. Never. Never too late. Ever. I mean ever. It's never too late. It's important. We have a defense. And not even disciple your children so that they'll have a defense of the faith. Disciple them so that they'll live good, godly Christian lives, and that they will be able to pass on that discipleship and maximize it when they have children, and their children will maximize it when they have children. It's a generational thing. It's not just something we do one time to make sure that they have arguments for God. It's for them too. It's for their well-being. It's for their spiritual development. We need to teach our children to continue in all righteousness.